All right, hi everybody. Welcome to our first hybrid small business update. This is the first time we've done this with people in the room and people at home, so it's very exciting. Thank you everyone for being here. So before we get started, a couple of things. I'm Jeanette Mulvey. I'm the editor-in-chief of CO, the Chamber's platform for small businesses. You've been watching us for 2 years now on your screens there. Like every event, you will be able to ask questions. So for those of you in the room, you can go on your phones and go to slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. And if you type in the password small biz update, you will be able to ask questions from the room. Those of you at home, you will be able to do that right on your screen like you always do in that box on the right-hand side of your screen. And I have an iPad here where I'll be getting the questions. So today, before we do anything else, let me thank our sponsors, Dell Technologies, Edelman Financial, FedEx, Iron Mountain, MetLife, and Oracle NetSuite. We will be talking about a lot of important issues today, and we thank them for their partnership in this series so that we are able to bring you this conversation. Today we'll be talking about a lot of challenges facing small business, hiring, workforce, the economy, inflation, supply chain, retail crime, cyber hacking, and anything else we can come up with today. So we have a lot to talk about. So let me introduce Neil Bradley. You all already know him. He is the U.S. Chamber's Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategic Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber. He is here, as always, to help break down the latest news and what it means to all of you and your small businesses. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Jeanette. Good to be with you again.
You too. In person?
In person. I like this.
All right, so let's start with workers. Small businesses are struggling to find workers, and there's definitely, I think, this phenomenon that there was this COVID stimulus that might or was keeping people out of the workforce, but most of that has ended, I think. Mm-hmm. So can you just talk about that? What is it all ended? And I'm talking about worker stimulus, not business stimulus. And what is keeping people out of the workforce? What's happening there?
Yeah, let's start with kind of the state of play, right? So we have the reason small businesses, and frankly every business, is having a hard time filling open jobs is because we have 4 million more open jobs than we have people looking for work. That is unusual. And in fact, it is almost ahistorical. Almost always the number of people looking for work actually exceeds the number of available jobs. That's why we worry about the unemployment rate and things like that. So as long as we've been keeping records since the early 1960s, we've never been in a moment like this. So why is so much mismatch? Part of it's on the demand side. There's a lot of pent-up demand and needs that businesses need to fill. That's driving the number of open jobs. But we also have fewer people in the workforce looking for work. If we had the same workforce participation rate that we did pre-pandemic, we would have about 2.5 million or so more people looking for work to fill those jobs. Now, by the way, it doesn't take hard math, 4 million, 2.5 million. We still have more open jobs than we have people, but it sure would go a long way. You're exactly right. The excess stimulus, the supplemental unemployment benefits that were given out during the pandemic, which certainly, based on our research, was keeping people out of the workforce, has expired. That doesn't mean that people aren't still availing themselves of kind of the pre-pandemic baseline of assistance that is providing some buffer for some people not to return to the workforce. But it's not just that. It's actually a complicated scenario. So when you dig into who are these people who used to be working, who now aren't working, and you say why and what are you doing, you get a pretty diverse picture. In some instances, it's working parents who a lack of affordable child care, access to affordable child care, means that they don't feel that they can return to the workforce, that the economics for their family, because of the cost of child care today, means that it's better for one parent to stay at home. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a fair number of people over the age of 55 who we would normally consider too young for retirement, who found that they had the financial wherewithal to go ahead and retire early. And so they've exited the workforce. You have some families who've just decided that a model of having two people in the workforce doesn't work for them, and so they've opted to do that. And then you actually have some really good reasons why some people aren't in the workforce today. This is my favorite statistic of all. There are about, of the people who worked for someone else pre-pandemic, who haven't returned to working for someone else today, about 10% of those are because they started their own business. Some of them are probably joining us and watching today on Co. That is not a bad thing. That's a wonderful and a good thing. But by the way, for every small business that existed pre-pandemic, it means you're now competing with those folks who maybe used to work for you who are trying to hire employees as well.
Right, and they need to hire too.
And they need to hire as well.
Right. So if you're a small business owner, what can you do to attract those people? And maybe, I don't want to call them programs, but what kind of maybe perks or, flexible arrangements, what kind of things could you offer that would maybe alleviate some of the concerns that you mentioned?
Well, what we hear from our small business members who I think are successfully challenging this is that they're playing to their competitive advantage. Small businesses have a tremendous competitive advantage because of your ability to really know your workforce, to know the people who work for you, and to figure out how you help them balance whether it's family needs and obligations with the schedule of work, so increased flexibility, to understanding how you may help them meet either financial challenges or health challenges. And so the advantage is that big companies, they have to have one program that kind of applies across the board for everyone. They can't have that flexibility. They don't have kind of the first name basis of knowing not only their employee, but knowing the names of their family members and their kids. So I think the most important thing is to play to that advantage. I think the second thing to do is recognize that there are a whole lot more resources out there that can give small businesses even more of a competitive advantage. I mentioned childcare and the problem that folks have accessing affordable childcare. When we tend to think about businesses stepping in to help employees with that, in our mind, we tend to go to a workplace-based child care center, which are incredibly expensive to set up and to operate, very difficult, probably out of the reach for a lot of small businesses. But what's in reach for a lot of small businesses is accessing third-party services that can help with finding childcare for your employee, accessing whatever federal or state benefits exist to help an employee afford that childcare. If it's not childcare, maybe it's who's going to pick up the kid when somebody is sick or when someone has to work late. There are services that help you do that that are pretty economical and actually that meet the needs of employees. And by the way, some of these things, if you provide them as a small business owner, thinking about those childcare third-party services, the government will give you an extra tax break for doing that. So I think thinking about things like that, thinking outside the box about how you can meet employee needs is important.
Yeah, and to your point, if you're a small business, you're more likely to know what those needs are and be able to create kind of a customized.
Yeah, you don't have to create a child care. That's
right.
Probably not what you need.
Right.
But you know what your employees need, and there's a lot of someone else has started a small business somewhere that helps meet that need, and part of it's just connecting your business with theirs
right.
and providing those benefits.
I think that's a great point. Let's talk about, we made it this far without talking about the I word, inflation. So everyone here is feeling it at home, in this room, businesses, personal expenses. What are you seeing as like the biggest areas that inflation is affecting businesses, and just where do we see that going?
Well, most of us have, in our professional careers, have never experienced anything like this, and we've certainly never led a business with this high of inflation. It's been 40 years since we've kind of hit these type of levels. You have some of the natural responses that businesses have to do. One of it is how much you can pass along to your customers. Our most recent MetLife U.S. Chamber Small Business Survey, 70% of small businesses have raised their prices for their customers as a result of inflation and their higher costs. Some of them are caught in the mismatch that you have to acquire supplies, you're paying a higher rate, but then you have to bridge until you get the revenue from your customers. That's why we see 40% of small businesses who've had to take out loans as a result of inflation. Your old business model and cash flow financing doesn't work because of inflation, and you have to figure out how to bridge that gap. I think the biggest danger kind of going forward when we think about it is the movement of inflation into wages and the potential spiral that creates. Wages are very sticky. They go up. They do not tend to go down. And so when you think about competition for talent, which we were just talking about, and you think about your inflationary pressures, you're having to balance that off. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for any employer today, is to figure out how, in response to inflation, in response to higher wage demands, you don't end up with significantly higher fixed costs that you may be stuck with in the future.
You mentioned pricing and how much of the cost increase that businesses need to pass along to their customers. And that's just a chance for me to plug that tomorrow at this exact same time, we will have a Start, Run, Grow event where I will be talking to a couple of different, a small business owner and a pricing expert about how they're making decisions about whether and when to raise their prices. But I wanted to ask you, do you get a sense from the small businesses you talk to about how they're thinking about raising prices? Because just like wages, once you raise them, it's hard to bring them down. Prices also, I think often you raise them and then you maybe tend not to bring them down. Do you know, or maybe businesses do. So do you just have any thoughts about that?
It depends on the business and it depends on the competitive environment and what you're in. I will say that early on in the inflationary pressure, I think there was a real reticence on the part of businesses on their belief that they could actually pass along higher prices. Looking at the data now and looking at the experience, I'm not sure there's much of a need for that reticence. Consumer demand remains remarkably strong overall. Now, it's moving a little bit. People went from really intensive goods purchases, because, by the way, we couldn't go anywhere during the pandemic, to now looking at more of a services oriented as they get back out to going out to dinner, to traveling, to doing events. And so, you have to think about where you are in that services good standpoint. But consumers haven't pulled back their spending. And if they're not pulling back their spending, they're adjusting that to take into account the higher prices that businesses are charging. And so this is a weird economy. I think some of you have heard from our economists recently. Like you have this pessimism about the recession, you have this sense of inflation, and then you have everyone saying, yep, but I'm hiring, I'm still doing my CapEx, and consumers who are saying, I'm still buying. And so that's a different formula than we've seen before.
Yeah. Let's just talk, probably, I think for the last time, about COVID era assistance for small businesses, sure, which has all, I think, basically ended. But I do still see a lot of talk about the employee retention tax credit and being able to file for it. But I thought that deadline was passed. Can you explain?
You're exactly right. And that is the last of the provisions that someone could take advantage of. The actual pay period. So the employee retention tax credit was a tax credit for small businesses that said that if you retained employees, even though you had had a significant loss in your revenue and income, I think it was 20% quarter to quarter measurements, and you have to go back and check which quarter you were in and when you were paying it, that the government would provide a tax credit each quarter to help offset some of that cost of retaining those employees. The eligibility to pay wages and receive the credit ended at the end of the third quarter last year, so over a year ago. But in the wonderful way of our tax system and the way the government works, you still have the ability through the end of calendar year 2022, so really 2.5 more months, to go back and figure out whether you claimed all the credits you were entitled to, and if you didn't, to file and receive those credits. So that's the reason you're seeing that. It's a good piece of advice. If you don't have a good reason to call your tax preparer or your accountant before the end of the year, this is a good reason to call them and just say, hey, did I take full advantage of that before we file our next quarterly statements on and remit any payroll taxes? Let's make sure we took full advantage of it.
Okay, great. So we have an election. I don't know if you know, but there's
Not
an
aware.
election coming.
In the UK?
And as part of what the chamber does, we encourage civic involvement and engagement here. So as a small business, what can small businesses do to encourage their employees to participate in democracy and feel like their voices are being heard?
Well, the first thing to do is, if you're eligible to vote, please vote. Everyone should vote. More voting is better. I think employers have a unique opportunity to make sure that their employees have information to know when and how they can vote. There's lots of different ways to vote in most places in America today. It isn't just election day. You can get an absentee ballot. You can already today, people are voting early in person in a lot of different states. And so we've created a tool at the U.S. Chamber that allows anyone to put in their zip code and to see what their voting options are. And so is early voting open for you? Can you request an absentee ballot? What precinct do you live in? And so if folks go to voteforjobs.com, you can do that. Employers could share that with their employees and make sure they have that information. If you have the flexibility to give employees off who want to vote on election day, give employees the flexibility. One of the important things that we've seen a number of small businesses and larger businesses begin to do is to recognize that elections don't run themselves. Everyone who remembers going voting in person, you talk to a lot of people going through, like, they check your name, someone gives you a ballot, someone else. That takes a lot of manpower. Voting precincts around the country are short on people to staff polling sessions. And so if you have the flexibility, if you have employees who are willing, connecting them with the local voting jurisdiction and giving them the time off to go staff the polls. It's a full day affair. In most jurisdictions, you have to go from the beginning of the morning till the end at night, but you sure do help democracy in the process, and you help your local areas. It's a great form of one-day community service.
Great. Just a reminder to everyone, put your questions in because I'll be getting to those soon. So I think we've all sadly seen these videos on the news of these retail crime operations where all of a sudden a store is swarmed with people filling their bags and running out, and this is like organized retail crime that we're talking about. And we're seeing a real increase in this across both big and small businesses being impacted by this. And I know this is a priority for the chamber to talk about this and advocate for some kind of solution. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the key, I feel like every night I turn on the local news and, it's things that are almost hard to grasp, right? So an eyeglass store where people are walking out with, 1,000, what are you gonna do with 1,000 eyeglass frames, right? But to your point, it's organized, and that's the whole point of this, that this is not the shoplifting of old. This is highly organized theft, and it's taking advantage of changes in the law over the last 20 years and people figuring out how they can avoid accountability. So we have members of the chamber who tell us about, in this organized shoplifting, not even the smash and grab, people coming in and they got a shopping list, a theft list in one hand, and a calculator in the other. Because they know in 40 jurisdictions, 40 states in the United States, we've raised the threshold for which you will be prosecuted for theft. And there's no aggregation. So I can walk into your store, and if the threshold's $700, as long as I walk out at $695, I'm not going to get prosecuted. And I can go to the next store and walk out again at $695, and I can keep doing that. They take those goods and they go through an organized retail crime network that then passes them off, often through to unknowing buyers, often through online sales platforms. So if you think about the old days when I was growing up, pre-internet, and someone stole something, the place to unload is you went to the pawn shop. And we had a concerted effort as government to make sure that people couldn't get rid of stolen goods at the pawn shop. Well, this is the modern day equivalent. We have to provide some protections there. In the old days, if you took something to a pawn shop, you actually had to show your photo ID, and they took down your information. And if it turned out the item was stolen, they knew where to come find you. We don't do that on the internet. So one of the things that we've called forth the U.S. Chamber is to apply that basic principle to large online sellers in these marketplaces. So this idea that you have to provide some basic information. If it turns out you're selling stolen goods, the folks will come after you. The second thing is that states need to update their laws. Get rid of the loopholes. Get rid of the 695 and 695 and I'm off scot-free. So have aggregation statutes so you can really clamp down on these people and go after them. And then ultimately prosecutors have to prosecute these crimes. So we got to get the tools to shut off the sales. We have to update the laws to close the loopholes. And then we got to get people to prosecute. There is progress being made. I think we're about to release an interview I did with the district attorney of San Diego County in San Diego, who has been pushing for these updates in laws. She's created an organized retail crime task force. They are breaking apart these criminal gangs who are targeting small businesses. And one of the most important things that she's done is she's engaged the local business community and small business owners in their efforts. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, to prosecute these people, they need some evidence, and they're really working together to do that. So for those online, I think they've dropped that link in. Take a look at it at your convenience. But there are real solutions to this problem if we just have the will to pursue them.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of threats to small businesses, let's talk a little bit about cyber crime. We know small businesses are really targeted because they have often less sophisticated defenses. So what are we seeing in that world?
A huge uptick. So in the same way that organized retail crime, that they've organized themselves and they're looking to achieve scale, cyber criminals are doing the same thing. So it used to be you would think about a small business and you say, what's the chances that I come on the radar of a criminal cyber syndicate in Russia or someplace else overseas? And you're like, the chances have got to be pretty low. Except what they figured out is that they want to pursue scale, and that they know that small businesses, as you said, have fewer defenses. They can now launch these cyber attacks at scale, and the cost to a small business of paying the ransom, we talked about pricing earlier. These criminals are actually pricing too. They know exactly the price point to convince you to pay them to unlock your data or whatever it is that they've captured of yours. And so the real key to preventing that is to up our games on cyber defenses. And so at the U.S. Chamber, we have a whole lot of resources. I know CO has resources as well to improve your cyber defenses, to really think about your vulnerabilities, particularly with your employees and access to network and where you store your data. And so I think that if I have a message is, there are simple things that you can do to protect yourself, and you should assume that if you haven't been a victim of a cyber attack already, you're going to be. So go ahead and do those simple things to provide you greater protection.
Lastly, what other sort of just general policy things do you see coming on the horizon that small businesses need to, be aware of, but also be proactive about preparing for?
Yeah, I think one of the areas where we're seeing the most change at the moment from a public policy standpoint is around labor law, and in particular independent contractors, and it's coming at the state level and at the federal level. There was recently a proposal at the federal level to change how the federal government views a classification of a worker as an independent contractor or an employee. During the pandemic, we spent a lot of time talking about PPP and whether it was applied to 1099 employees. We're now past that, but we now have policy that's going to force a rethinking as to whether a current 1099 contractor is actually an employee. At the state level, we've seen movement, California and Massachusetts, to do the same thing, but also to reinvent how businesses operating. I think one of the ones that we're paying a lot of attention to is a proposal in California that's now law that basically takes a subset of an industry. In this case, it's fast food franchises. And it says that for purposes of those businesses, the pay for employees and the workplace rules will not be set between the employer and their employees, but instead will be set by a 10-member board. And so this quasi-government board will decide how much you have to pay your employees if you're in that sector. We're watching it both because of the impact to that particular sector, but because if it's successful, we know it will be replicated to other sectors. It's very much akin to some of the ways that businesses operate in Europe, which has much less of a small business culture than we have in the United States, in part because they have that kind of large sectoral control across sectors. So of the things that I'm paying attention to, it's really in the employment and the compensation space. It really is around state and federal efforts to change independent contractor status, and then this concept of introducing a quasi form of sectoral bargaining government that removes the ability of small business owners or any other business owner that's covered to really run their business.
Okay, so I'm going to go to some audience questions. Well, so this is about immigration. It says that the visa application process is slow.
That's generous.
And so this person is asking what could be done on the government side to streamline the process. And I will add to this question, is there anything businesses can do to get around it or make it easier or get in the express lane? I don't know if that's a thing,
there are some express lanes. The government tends to charge more for the benefit of the express lane. Express is also generous too, so it's not as much of a fast lane as you would expect. We're incredibly frustrated by the delays in the visa process and the application, both in the process for how a business says, hey, we'd like to take we would like to have a legal worker here on a visa, to how those are awarded. By the way, most of them, because they're oversubscribed, you have to win the lottery. So this is all about, you go through all this paperwork just to hope that you win the lottery, then to hope that the consulate offices and wherever that individual is coming from do the paperwork in a timely fashion. The government has gotten a little bit better on the consulate processing the timeline. We're pushing them to continue to do that. We were successful about a week or so ago in getting the administration to already announce that they will provide the full number of H-2B visas. It's a small step. It's still going to be oversubscribed, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the administration, across administrations, need to do a better job of processing, need to be resourced to do that, and then we just need more visas. You know, the worst thing in the world is to go through all that paperwork, lose the lottery, you still don't have the worker that you need, and all you're out is a lot of man hours.
I like this question, because the next one, because we talk about inflation all the time, but actually don't ask this question. So this person says, there's tons of inflation across all kinds of industries. What could the government be doing to fight inflation?
Well, I think first to understand the root cause of inflation. At its basic element, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, and that's when prices go up, and so that's always the case. There are two sides to that equation. There's the too few goods side, and then there's the too much money side. On the too much money side, governments around the world, including the United States, greatly expanded the amount of money in the economy, both from a fiscal standpoint. Think about all the assistance that Congress appropriated and provided, new money that was injected into the economy. We hit record levels of like consumer savings that they're currently spending down, and that was savings that was driven by the pandemic relief. Also, the Federal Reserve, central banks control the amount of currency out there. They increased the balance sheets and they put more money out there. So we had more money coming from Congress, we had more money coming from the monetary authorities. We're still at record levels of money out there. And then on the supply side, the pandemic created lots of bottlenecks. And so, whether it was microchip shortages that meant that you couldn't get cars and boats and alarm clocks and anything that had a computer chip in it, to the problems at the West Coast ports, to currently the energy crisis and the lack that we're still not producing as much energy as we were producing pre-pandemic, those create shortages. So, in that environment, you need the Federal Reserve to do what only it can do, which is begin to reduce the money supply, and they're doing that, and that's uncomfortable and it's painful. That's why interest rates are going up, but it's really the only kind of tools that they have to do that. It would be great if that was complemented on the policy side by addressing some of these supply shortages, by unlocking more energy production so that we could meet needs. We just mentioned visas, on the other hand. A big shortage in the current economy that's driving prices higher is workers. So if we had more people coming to the country to work legally, we could meet demand, we would have more supply, and that would lower prices. So that's what government could be doing. The Fed's doing its job. I hope after we get through the political season that we can get the political branches focused on the parts that only they can do.
Okay. Back to retail crime. I feel like you covered this a little bit, so if you don't think there's any more to say, that's fine. But this person was asking what the changes in the law need to be to fight the organized retail crime. But I feel like you said making it so that it's cumulative.
Yeah, there are really three things. States need to do aggregation rules so that you can aggregate up the theft. Two, a lot of these operate, if you think about your hometown prosecutor, they're responsible probably for your county or your city. These organized retail crimes syndicates aren't kind enough to organize themselves into our political boundaries. They operate across county lines. If you really want to go after them, you need to give the authority to go after county lines. Those are the two big things that states can do. And at the federal government, only the feds can really regulate or provide rules for the internet. And we need to do this kind of know the seller rule for people who suddenly are selling, 3,000 pairs of eyeglass frames on some platform and then disappear the next day.
Right. Okay. This is about government contracts for small business. So the government generally sets aside a certain percent of its contracts specifically to be given to small business. So, right?
Yes. Yep. Contracts and subcontracts. A lot of people forget about the subs.
So this person just asks, and I don't know if you can go through all of this, but just generally, what does that process look like? I think you need to sort of be certified first, right?
You generally do, and so SBA.gov, that's the Small Business Administration, can kind of help you with a lot of those certification processes. If you're in an industry where you're only going to work with one federal agency, let's say you're doing work with the Defense Department or defense programs, they'll have an office that's dedicated to making sure that they meet their small business goals, and you might be able to work through them. But if you're just getting started in this space, a great place to start is SBA.gov.
Okay.
By the way, I should mention, everyone thinks this is the feds. Don't forget states and increasingly local governments also have small business contractor programs. And so, you may not get, particularly here in the service industry, you may not be able to land a contract to do large federal facilities, but I would look at state facilities or municipal facilities in your area, and there's often preferences for small businesses in those states.
This question is about cybercrime. I know, for example, that small business bank accounts are not protected against cybercrime the way that personal bank accounts are. And this person is asking, what could the government be doing in terms of regulation to help protect small businesses against cybercrime?
Well, I think there are two parts, maybe three parts to that. I mean, I think one of the most important things that the government can be doing, this isn't really about insuring against the cost of loss, it's preventing the loss in the first place. So the government is and can continue to provide more resources to small businesses to help protect themselves. By the way, the government should also be spending time doing only what government can do, which is disrupt these networks. You are not going to go disrupt a cyber criminal outfit in Russia, but the government can and does, and we need to encourage them to keep doing that. And they're doing that, but we need more of it. In terms of the regulatory standpoint, to the basis of the question, I don't know that the answer is, because it would come with considerable cost, because if you're going to insure the bank accounts against cyber theft, then we have to pay for that it has to be paid for somewhere. And so I think that's a little more complicated than a simple regulatory answer. But first is let's get on defense, and then let's get on offense against the people doing this, and then hopefully we'll have a lot less need for figuring out how to backfill accounts that have been drained.
Things like maybe changing your bank password once in a while.
There are
Be a
a
good place to
whole
start.
bunch of tips
Yeah.
About things that you should do that don't need government regulation, but are good best practices, either personally or for your business.
Yeah.
Sometimes we think about our business and forget about our personal accounts, and the just adding the one or the exclamation point at the end of the password you've used every time is not the best strategy, I'm told.
I should have asked you this question before we ever got to the audience Q&A. So this person references Hurricane Ian. So I hate this, but we always have an opportunity to talk about emergency disaster assistance loans from the SBA. So
Yes.
maybe we could just touch on that. But also, this person says they own properties that were damaged. Do they qualify for help from FEMA as a landlord, or is that they should be looking at EIDL loans?
So first, go to U.S. Chamber Foundation and on the web, and we actually have a whole suite of assistance for small businesses and disasters, not just Hurricane Ian, but wildfires, tornadoes. So we have a whole help desk as well that small businesses, if you're in one of those situations, you can call the help desk and they will kind of help you work through what's available to you. I'd have to know more about the individual situation. So you have, once you have a federally declared disaster, that unlocks both SBA, EIDL, disaster loans. It can also unlock FEMA assistance. Most FEMA assistance is on the individual level, but there is, depending on the degree of the disaster, depending on what's done, there is some FEMA work. They also obviously employ lots of people locally in a disaster to clear debris, provide supplies, et cetera. But the best bet, only knowing kind of what was mentioned there, go to U.S. Chamber Foundation, call that help desk, and they can provide references.
Yeah, I feel like that might be what the question was asking, is FEMA only for individual assistance? So the answer is not, and mostly, but not entirely.
Not entirely. There are exceptions, but generally think about FEMA as individual assistance, not entirely, and think about SBA as a business assistance.
Do SBA disaster loans have to be repaid?
They do.
Yeah. So I think sometimes we think about those as like free money, but they're really
No.
loans.
I mean, it's cheap money.
Right.
The interest rates are very cheap. The terms are quite favorable.
Right, but it's not a grant.
But it is not a grant.
Right. Okay. I saw on the news this morning in my hotel room at 4:30 a.m. that I don't even remember who it was, but someone said there was a 100% chance that we're going to be in a recession. Yeah. So this person says, are we in a recession or not?
Well, none of the things, leaving aside sentiment, none of the traditional economic indicators show the things you would see in a recession. Unemployment is at historic lows. Sales, we just got the September retail sales number, Xing out autos and gasoline, which were highly volatile. Retail sales kept pace exactly even with inflation. So, the consumers were operating that way. Traditionally, when you're in a recession, you see employers pulling back on hiring. You see them pulling back on CapEx, capital investment, and you see consumers pulling back on spending. We're off kind of some of our session highs, if you will, in all of those categories: hiring, CapEx, and retail sales. But we're kind of maintaining at elevated levels. So we've come down off a peak, but we are not heading down into negative territory. We are not seeing huge increases in unemployment. That's different than where we are. So that's where we are today. Where will we be in the future? This is the great question. Can the Federal Reserve find the right point where it's raising interest rates, that it's managed to pull back demand sufficient to drop prices without pulling back demand so far that we go into a recession? So that middle area is called the soft landing, kind of the Goldilocks zone. And so it remains to be seen whether we're going to hit that or not. I think the reason that you see, I saw that report as well, the reason that you see people saying 100% chance is because all the economic data I cited just a minute ago says that the Fed needs to do even more interest rate hikes to be able to bring demand down. And so the hotter the economy is, that requires the more rate hikes from the Federal Reserve, the greater you run the risk, because the separation's so high that you can't stick the landing into the Goldilocks zone. So I think that's the reason that folks are saying that. We'll find out if they're right.
This person's asking, I have sort of two questions here. One is asking, how do I prepare my business for a recession? And one is asking, how do I prepare my employees for a recession? So do you have any thoughts from what you're hearing from small businesses?
Well, I think this goes back to our very initial conversation about how you're dealing with inflationary pressures, how you're dealing with wage pressure and your employees. I mean, I think you have to think through, what fixed costs are you locking yourselves into? If you're taking out loans to be able to manage the cash flow float for the higher prices that you're paying today and what you get from your consumers, how much increased debt are you taking on? And I think, not to say that you shouldn't do those things, not to say that you shouldn't raise wages to keep employees, that you shouldn't take out those loans to bridge that. I just think you got to be really careful about thinking about where you end up if we are in a recession and what you're going to have the wherewithal to be able to manage through. I think another new point, traditionally when we've had a recession in the United States, you see significant number of layoffs, a rise in unemployment, kind of a reshuffling of employees as we come out of the recession, people come back to work. It's not at all clear that that's what it's going to look like if we have a recession this time. A lot of employers feel like they couldn't get the employees that they used to have back in the pandemic, and they look at the demographics for good reason and wonder if there'll be any employees left as they come out of the pandemic. So I think one thing to think through as you're preparing that is, to the last part of the question is, are your employees able to weather it? Can you figure out a way where with your employees you can weather it and they can weather a downturn in the economy and you still maintain them as employees? And so we saw a number of states begin to experiment with, the federal government experimented with this idea that during a downturn, employees keep employees on maybe part-time, but the unemployment system compensates for part of their payroll shortfall. There's a number of states who've created these programs. If I were thinking ahead, if I would want to know, does my state do that? And is that something that I would want to take advantage of, both so I could help my employees, but also so I could help myself keep the employees that I have in the event that I'm in a downturn that breaks demand and would cause me to need to cut costs?
So this question ties together almost everything we've talked about so far. So we've all heard of quiet quitting, which is like the trendy way of saying your employees are sitting at their desk doing something other than working. I just came from a workshop this morning where the leader mentioned a statistic that says that at their best, employees are 34% engaged at work, and that was in good times. We're talking about, yeah, right. So we're talking about trying to retain employees. We're talking about trying to do more with less and be more efficient with how you spend your dollars at your business. It's hard to find new employees. So do you have any thoughts about how small businesses in particular can just be engaging their employees more to inspire them to want to really put in their best effort to stay? We touch on like the child care thing, but just more generally, do you think there are advantages that small businesses have over bigger businesses to really connect with their employees and promote engagement that's good for the bottom line?
Oh, I think small businesses have such a leg up on big businesses in this regard. And in part because you have the ability to vest your employees in the business's success. Most small businesses, the employees know exactly who the customers are. They have a sense for whether demand's strong or demand's weak. They know whether what the economic situation is that is driving your business. So I think the advantage that small businesses have is to be crystal clear and transparent with their employees about how they're doing and how, if you're in a moment where demand exceeds anything that you could meet, how you're trying to manage that and engage them in managing that. And then, by the way, to talk through the obverse, that at some point, this demand is going to fall off, and how you want to manage that. And so, I think there's a huge opportunity to invest your employees on the upside that you may be experiencing right now, and at the same time prepare them for the downside and have them be partners in how you're running that business, and maybe how they're thinking about their own overtime and their own ability to meet your demand in a way that a big business just can't do.
So that addresses essentially being competitive in a hiring market, and I have a lot of questions about how to be competitive with consumers. So a lot of people are asking, how do I make my business more competitive?
I don't know if I can offer advice and thoughts on a lot of things. I think this audience knows a heck of a lot better how to make your business competitive. You've already figured it out. I guess the only thing I would say is that if you're asking that question, you're probably already on the right track. That the only thing that would really worry me is if people weren't asking that question, because it would assume that we aren't in a highly, highly competitive environment. So I don't have great advice to offer folks. I would tell them to go to Co and think about their particular questions. You have a whole host of resources about how to improve operations internally, how to improve your marketing, how to take advantage of the social media that my son's on all the time. He's getting served up lots of ads by somebody. It might as well be you selling him on. He likes go-kart racing, by the way. So if you're in that business, that's really good for my son. So take advantage of those things. I think that's the way to think about it. But whoever asked the questions, already answering the right questions, go to Co and just keep doing it.
A lot of questions here about how to make yourself more attractive for a government contract. Do you want to just talk about, is being certified as a veteran-owned business or a woman-owned business, is that a necessary first step, or at least a good first step? Is that something that a business should do before they try to apply for a government contract, or is it not really
Oh, I definitely
necessary.
would. So as we talked about earlier, you have small business set-asides, you have minority set-asides, veteran-owned business set-asides, women-owned business set-asides. You also have set-asides into economically disadvantaged zones. So you can figure out if you're in one of those zones to qualify for that advantage. All of those do require some type of certification. You have to demonstrate that you actually meet the qualification of that. That doesn't mean that you have to do that to compete for a government contract. But if you do that, then you're competing in a government contract with the whole purpose of it is a leg up. That you know that that if they award that to you, then as a veteran-owned business, they're helping meet their goal of veteran-owned businesses. If they don't know that about you, maybe they're meeting their small business goal, but they don't know that they're meeting that veteran-owned business goal. So yes, I think people should do that. That's a clear first, not essential, but if you're planning to do this, absolutely do it if you think there's any chance at all you meet any of the requirements.
Great. We talked about being civic-minded as a business owner before by encouraging or allowing employees to vote, give them time to vote. Obviously, they're allowed to vote, and maybe encouraging them to work at the polls. And I think that this idea of being civic-minded as a small business owner is sort of almost comical because every small business owner is civic-minded because they are in their community and they're all giving back and they're all creating jobs and providing services and goods. So as just part of their business plan, right? So as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, do we, I want to just give a chance for you to say how important small businesses are to not only the entire U.S. economy, but to their neighborhoods and to the people they employ, and just what is the Chamber's sort of position on that?
Well, it's in our DNA. It's who we are. I mean, if you ever come to the Chamber, we have this wonderful building. We're right across the street from the White House. There are two things to know about this building. When you walk through the front door, you'll see a huge bronze plaque with cities from all over the United States that 100 years ago raised and contributed money so that business would have a place in Washington to represent them. The other thing, because it's too big for us to put on a bronze plaque to commemorate, we have this wonderful book of small businesses all across the United States who chipped in $1, $2, $5. And it's fascinating because you look at some of them. Some of the businesses, by the way, 100 years later are still around. Some of them are in industries that don't exist anymore. So it's fascinating to look through. So it's in our DNA, and that's never stopped. When I think about the U.S. economy, and I think about it as kind of an ecosystem, and the ecosystem can't operate without small businesses. The small businesses aren't just important on Main Street in the community that they operate in. They're really important there. You're community citizens. You're doing everything from providing employment to sponsoring the Little League to helping improve the city to being leaders, community leaders. People look up to small business owners in their communities. They're some of the most important, not just community leaders, but community volunteers and leading the charitable work. But collectively, that gives reach beyond someone's own community. If you think about that ecosystem, there are businesses, bigger businesses, the biggest businesses, that can't survive without small businesses because you're their suppliers or you're their customers. And so when we think about that mosaic, we don't forget about where we come from, but we also realize that if something were to happen to small business in America, it isn't that small businesses would suffer, it's that the entire system would fall apart, that it doesn't operate. I mentioned earlier the difference between us and Europe. I'm proud of the US system. I think it is a better system. I think one of the things that make it better is the fact that we have all this entrepreneurialism and this small business. And if that ever goes away, we stop being who we are.
Well, I can't think of a better place to stop it than right there. So I'm going to say thank you. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the audience at home. It was my pleasure to interview you in person.
We'll have to
And,
do it again in person. This is
yeah.
nice. This is fun.
And we'll see everyone tomorrow to tune into our Start, Run, Grow, a segment on pricing. So thanks, everyone. Take care.